Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a long, slow journey back to a chilling chapter in colonial American history. A time when fear and rigid belief systems twisted legal processes into something truly bizarre. We're heading to the late 17th century, specifically to the era of the infamous witch trials. Our focus isn't on the sensational headlines, but on the truly fascinating and often unsettling, odd legal loopholes of colonial American witch trials. Imagine yourself not tucked safely in your bed, but perhaps sitting on a hard wooden bench in a dimly lit colonial courtroom. The air thick with tension, listening to accusations that defy logic. You probably won't survive the mental image without appreciating the immense distance between then and now, and how utterly bewildering justice could be. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop a comment below with where you're listening from and what time it is. Light, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported to a small, wooden meeting house in a colonial New England village, perhaps in the frigid winter of 1692. The air is cold, damp, and heavy with unspoken anxieties. Outside, snow muffles the sounds of the distant forest, but inside, a different kind of chill permeates the room. There's a palpable sense of unease, a tension that crackles like static electricity. People eye each other nervously, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of candles, their shadows dancing on the rough-hewn walls. This isn't just a community gathering. It's a place where whispers in Salem and other towns could quickly escalate into accusations that had devastating consequences. Plain historical fact is that the infamous Salem witch trials, while the most well-known, were not isolated incidents. Witchcraft accusations and trials had occurred periodically throughout colonial New England for decades prior, though rarely on such a concentrated and deadly scale. These events were rooted in a deep-seated Puritan belief in the literal existence of the devil and his earthly agents, witches, who were believed to make a pact with him to harm others. You would feel the pervasive influence of this belief system, knowing that every unexplained illness, every lost cow, every spoiled crop could be attributed to malevolent magical forces. Now, for a quirky tidbit, the initial accusations in Salem often started with younger girls exhibiting strange fits, contortions, and outbursts which the local minister and physicians struggled to explain by natural means. These afflicted girls became the primary accusers, their dramatic public displays providing compelling evidence. Imagine a whole community watching these performances, convinced they were witnessing the work of the devil rather than, perhaps, mass hysteria, or psychological distress. It certainly fueled the fire, didn't it? Historians still argue whether the initial afflictions were genuine psychological phenomena, calculated performances for attention, or even a form of early social protest by marginalized individuals. Was it true bewitchment, or something far more mundane, yet equally powerful in its impact? Regardless, the atmosphere of suspicion was a suffocating blanket that settled over the Puritan communities. You would sense the quiet paranoia, the fear that anyone, a neighbor, a stranger, even a family member, could be a witch, leading to a chilling eagerness to believe the worst. The whispers, once harmless gossip, became the very threads that wove the terrible tapestry of the colonial witch trials. As the chilling whispers and dramatic afflictions set the stage for the witch trials, your attention now turns to one of the most perplexing and dangerous legal loopholes that allowed accusations to spiral out of control: spectral evidence. This wasn't about tangible proof. It was about invisible afflictions experienced only by the accusers, becoming admissible testimony in court. A mainstream historical fact is that spectral evidence referred to the testimony of the afflicted. Individuals, primarily young women and girls, claiming to see the specter or ghostly form of the accused, which tormenting them, pinching them, or even choking them, even when the accused person was physically elsewhere. The core tenet was that the devil could not use the specter of an innocent person to do his evil work. Therefore, if the specter was seen, the person was inherently guilty. You would sit in the courtroom, listening to a young girl shriek that her specter is pinching me, while the accused, perhaps an elderly woman, stood stoically, her hands tied, completely unable to defend herself against an invisible assailant. Now, for a quirky tidbit. Torments could be incredibly vivid and dramatic. They would writhe on the floor, complain of being bitten or pricked, and point wildly at the accused, even if the accused was miles away or in jail. The judges, deeply rooted in their belief system, saw these reactions as irrefutable proof of demonic activity. Imagine a judge earnestly asking the afflicted if they could specifically identify the specter of the accused, as if it were as real as the wooden benches in the courtroom. It was a bizarre twist on eyewitness testimony, wasn't it? Historians still argue whether the acceptance of spectral evidence by the courts was primarily a reflection of deeply held Puritan theological beliefs about the devil's direct influence, or if it was a pragmatic, though ultimately disastrous, attempt to find some form of evidence in cases where traditional proof was impossible. Was it zealous faith or desperate legal maneuvering? Regardless, this loophole effectively removed the need for any conventional, verifiable evidence. You would feel the chilling injustice of it, knowing that a person's life could hang on the unseen torments described by another. The courtroom, you realize, became a stage where invisible battles were fought, and the accused stood no chance against an enemy only their accusers could perceive. From the chilling concept of spectral evidence, your mind now turns to another peculiar diagnostic method employed in the witch trials, one that frequently led to a logical dead end for the accused: the touch test paradox. This was a strange, often contradictory, diagnostic method that could condemn an innocent person through no fault of their own. mainstream historical fact is that the touch test was frequently used in colonial American witch trials. The theory was that when an accused witch touched their alleged victim during a fit or torment, the victim's symptoms, convulsions, pain, etc., would immediately cease, as the witch's malefic influence was momentarily transferred. You would witness an afflicted person writhing on the floor, seemingly in agony, only for their symptoms to dramatically stop the moment the accused witch's hand brushed against them. This sudden cessation of suffering was then presented as undeniable proof of the accused guilt, indicating their power over the victim. Now for a quirky tidbit: the paradox, of course, was that if the accused didn't touch the victim and the fits continued, that could also be seen as proof of their guilt. They were so powerful that their spectral influence didn't even need physical contact to cause torment. It was a classic damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. Imagine being the accused, brought forward, perhaps reluctantly, to touch an afflicted person, knowing that whatever happened, it would likely be twisted into evidence against you. It was a rigged game, wasn't it? Historians still argue whether the touch test's apparent success was due to the psychological suggestibility of the accusers, genuine psychosomatic reactions, or outright manipulation. Was it a dramatic performance or a desperate attempt to explain inexplicable symptoms? Regardless, this peculiar test became a powerful piece of evidence, especially when combined with spectral testimony. You would feel the immense pressure. In that courtroom, the silent desperation of the accused as they were forced to participate in a test designed to condemn them. The very act of touching, usually a gesture of comfort, was weaponized, turning a simple human interaction into a trap with no escape, all within the strangely logical framework of colonial superstition. From the perplexing touch test, your attention now shifts to perhaps the most devastating and insidious of the legal loopholes in the witch trials. Confession's cruel trap. This wasn't about seeking truth. It was about securing an admission of guilt often through psychological manipulation and the promise of mercy, which ironically sealed the fate of many, even truly innocent individuals. A mainstream historical fact is that in many witch trials, particularly in Salem, a confessed witch was often spared execution, while those who maintained their innocence and refused to confess were much more likely to be found guilty and hanged. The logic was perverse. If you confessed, it meant you had repented and could potentially be saved by God's grace. If you denied, you were stubbornly aligning yourself with the devil. You would witness the harrowing choice presented to the accused: lie and live, or tell the truth and die. Imagine the agonizing dilemma, a choice between your integrity and your very life. Especially for those who genuinely believed in God and abhorred the idea of false confession. Now, for a quirky tidbit, the confessions themselves were often remarkably similar, featuring stock phrases about signing the devil's book, flying on broomsticks, or tormenting victims. This suggests that the confessions were often coaxed or guided by the interrogators rather than being spontaneous revelations. Accused individuals might be subjected to sleep deprivation, relentless questioning, or even light torture, though torture was less common in colonial America than in Europe. Psychological pressure was intense until they broke. Imagine an exhausted, terrified person, desperate for relief, finally remembering details suggested by their accusers just to make it all stop. It sounds less like a confession and more like a carefully orchestrated narrative, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether the authorities genuinely believed these coerced confessions represented real pacts with the devil, or if they were a pragmatic, albeit morally reprehensible means to bring the trials to a quick, decisive end. Was it sincere belief or a desperate legal strategy? Regardless, the cruel trap of confession transformed the accused into unwilling accomplices in their own condemnation. You would feel the immense psychological weight of that choice, the quiet desperation of a person pushed to their limits, forced to betray their truth in a desperate bid for survival. The courtroom, you realize, became a theater of psychological torment, where the greatest lie offered the only escape from the psychological torment of forced confessions. Your attention shifts to another insidious form of proof in the witch trials, which marks and proof. These weren't about character or testimony. They were about supposed physical blemishes on the body, interpreted as undeniable signs of a pact with malevolent forces, sealing an accused person's fate. A mainstream historical fact is that witch marks or devil's marks were believed to be physical indications on the body, where the devil had touched a witch to seal their pact, or where a familiar spirit, a demonic helper, often in animal form, would suckle. These marks could be anything from moles, warts, birthmarks, or even old scars, common blemishes that almost anyone possessed. Examiners, often reputable community members, sometimes even juries of women, would meticulously search the accused body for these suspicious spots. You would imagine the humiliating and invasive process, the cold, prying eyes searching every inch of a person's skin for an arbitrary blemish. Now, for a quirky tidbit, the crucial part of identifying. A true witch mark was often the pricking test. If the mark was pricked with a needle or pin and it didn't bleed or cause pain, it was considered proof of a witch's insensitivity to pain, thus confirming it as a devil's mark. Of course, the results could easily be manipulated by the examiner using dull needles, or finding calloused areas, or by the accused if they were genuinely numb from fear or a pre-existing condition. Imagine an accused individual wincing in pain as a pin pricks their skin, only to be told their reaction was proof of their demonic deception. It was another no-win situation, wasn't it? Historians still argue whether the belief in witch marks was a genuine medical theory of the time, albeit a deeply flawed one, or if it was a convenient pseudo-scientific justification for condemning individuals based on physical appearance or existing prejudice. Was it primitive forensics or an excuse for persecution? Regardless, the search for these supposed marks transformed common human imperfections into damning evidence. Feel the invasive scrutiny, the cold terror of having your own body betray you through an ordinary mole. The silence of the examination room, broken only by the whispers of the searchers, would be thick with the desperate hope that no proof would be found, even as the deck was stacked against you. From the invasive search for witch marks, your attention now shifts to a seemingly straightforward, yet strangely fraught test that often condemned the accused, the prayer test failure. In a deeply religious society like colonial New England, the inability to recite scripture was seen as undeniable proof of a demonic pact, a sign that the devil himself had stolen a witch's piety. A mainstream historical fact is that accused witches were often compelled to recite passages from the Bible, the Lord's Prayer, or the Ten Commandments in court. The belief was that a true witch, having renounced God and made a pact with the devil, would be supernaturally unable to accurately recite sacred text, or might falter, stumble, or even reverse words. This wasn't just a memory test. It was a spiritual litmus test with eternal consequences. You would hear the accused, perhaps an elderly woman, her voice trembling with fear or age, attempting to recall the familiar words. Every hesitation scrutinized by a room full of fervent believers. Now for a quirky tidbit. The pressure and terror of the situation alone could cause even a devout person to falter, stammer, or forget. An uneducated person might genuinely struggle with reciting lengthy passages from memory, especially under duress. The accusers, often exhibiting dramatic fits, might also conveniently claim to be tormented during the recitation, causing the accused to lose their concentration, which was then interpreted as the devil's intervention. Their mind racing with fear, trying desperately to recall a passage, only for their perfectly natural nervousness to be taken as definitive proof of their unholiness. It was a cruel psychological trap, wasn't it? Historians still argue whether the consistent failures of the prayer test were primarily due to the immense psychological pressure on the accused, or if there were genuine instances of speech impediments or illiteracy that were misinterpreted as demonic interference. Was it a test of faith or a test of nerves under extreme duress? Regardless, the inability to flawlessly recite sacred scripture became a powerful piece of circumstantial evidence, especially when combined with other proofs. You would feel the suffocating silence in the courtroom, broken only by the accused. Faltering voice, knowing that every pause, every stumble, sealed their grim fate. The words meant to save them became the very chains that bound them. From the chilling failure of the prayer test, your mind drifts to, perhaps, the most infamous, and certainly the most absurd of the witch trial tests, the dunking trial's absurdity. Often known as swimming a witch, this method, deeply rooted in ancient superstition, presented an impossible no-win outcome for the accused, ensuring condemnation regardless of the result. A mainstream historical fact is that the swimming a witch test, while less frequently used in colonial America than in some parts of Europe, it was generally viewed with more skepticism by Puritan authorities, did occasionally occur, and was part of the popular folklore surrounding witchcraft. The theory was based on the belief that pure water would reject a witch who had renounced their baptism and allied with the devil. Therefore, a person accused of witchcraft was bound and thrown into water. If they floated, they were deemed guilty and a witch. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent, but, of course, dead. You would witness the grim spectacle, a crowd gathered by a cold river or pond, as an accused individual was bound and submerged, their fate sealed by an impossible choice. Now, for a quirky tidbit, the methods of binding the accused varied, but often involved tying their thumbs to their opposite big toes. This awkward position was believed to make it impossible for a witch to swim, supposedly ensuring that if they floated, it was due to supernatural buoyancy. Imagine being tied in such a constricting, uncomfortable way, then thrown into icy water, knowing that your natural instincts to survive, to float, would literally condemn you. It's a test designed for failure, isn't it? Historians still argue whether the dunking trial was ever truly considered a legitimate legal procedure by the most educated colonial authorities, or if it was largely a desperate act of mob justice, or superstitious villagers bypassing formal courts. Was it a judicial tool or an act of popular vigilantism? Regardless, the sheer absurdity and inherent cruelty of the dunking trial highlight the desperate and illogical extremes to which fear and superstition could push a community. You would feel the biting cold of the water, the desperate struggle for breath, and the chilling realization that there was no way to prove your innocence and survive. The splash of the water was not a sound of cleansing, but a resounding declaration of a predetermined, unjust verdict. It certainly puts a new spin on going for a swim. From the chilling absurdity of the dunking trial, your attention shifts to the very voices that drove the witch hunt's engine, the testimony from the afflicted. In a profound perversion of justice, the dramatic claims of often young, impressionable individuals, frequently children, held undue power, overriding reason and condemning their neighbors. A mainstream historical fact is that in the Salem witch trials, the testimonies of the afflicted girls and later some adults formed the primary and often sole basis for accusation and conviction. Their vivid descriptions of spectral torment, unseen by anyone else, were considered compelling, irrefutable evidence. These accusers were treated with immense sympathy and belief by the community and the courts. Their every complaint taken as absolute truth. You would sit in the courtroom watching a young person seemingly convulse or shriek in pain, pointing a trembling finger at an accused individual, and witnessed the immediate, profound impact their testimony had on the assembled magistrates and jury. Now for a quirky tidbit. The performances of the afflicted were often quite theatrical, complete with dramatic falls, fits of choking, declarations of being pinched or bitten by invisible entities, and screams of agony. These displays were so convincing that even hardened observers believed they were witnessing genuine bewitchment. Some historians suggest that the girls, consciously or unconsciously, learned to escalate their performances based on the reactions they received, inadvertently creating a feedback loop of escalating hysteria. Imagine a courtroom where the most dramatic actor wins, and the accused, often bewildered and stoic, simply cannot compete with such a compelling performance. It was a terrifying reality show, wasn't it? Historians still argue whether the afflictions were genuine psychosomatic responses to extreme societal stress and religious fervor, or if they involved elements of conscious deceit, perhaps for attention or to settle personal grievances. Was it mass hysteria or calculated deception? Regardless, the undue power granted to the testimony of these afflicted individuals created a chilling precedent. You would feel the quiet terror in the room, the palpable fear of being named by one of the accusers, knowing that their word, however unfounded, held more weight than any denial or logical defense you could offer. The voices of the afflicted became the relentless soundtrack of condemnation, sealing fate with every dramatic whisper. From the chilling testimony of the afflicted, your mind now turns to another peculiar piece of evidence that could seal an accused witch's fate: familiars and accusation. In the eyes of colonial law and belief, even the most innocent household pet could become a damning accomplice, a silent witness to demonic ties. A mainstream historical fact is that a familiar was believed to be a demonic spirit, often taking the form of an animal, a cat, dog, bird, toad, or even a spider that served a witch, carrying out their malicious commands and often feeding from the witch's body. Hence, the search for witch marks or teats on the accused. If an accused person had an unusual affection for a pet, or if a stray animal frequently visited their home, it could be interpreted as a sign of a familiar. You would imagine a lonely individual finding comfort in the companionship of a small animal, only for that innocent bond to be twisted into evidence of their dark alliance. Now for a quirky tidbit: the descriptions of familiars in trial records could be quite specific and strange. Accusers might claim to have seen the familiar in its animal form, or even conversing with the accused. In some cases, if a pet was present during an accusation, it might even be tested for its demonic nature, perhaps by being physically harmed to see if it reacted supernaturally. Imagine an innocent, purring cat suddenly becoming a key piece of evidence in a witchcraft trial, its every twitch and meow scrutinized for signs of the devil's influence. It truly adds a layer of surrealism to the proceedings, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether the belief in familiars reflected older European folk superstitions about animal spirits, or if it was a convenient narrative device to explain the supposed supernatural powers of witches. Was it ancient folklore or a legal fabrication? Regardless, the accusation of possessing a familiar was a powerful piece of circumstantial evidence. You would feel the cold judgment as your beloved pet, perhaps a faithful dog or comforting cat, was suddenly transformed into an instrument of your alleged evil. The quiet presence of your animal companion, once a source of solace, became a terrifying, silent accuser, proving that in the colonial witch trials, even the most innocent connections could lead to condemnation. From the chilling notion of animal familiars, your thoughts now delve into the very core of the alleged transgression that underpinned all. witchcraft's accusations. The Devil's Book. This wasn't a metaphorical concept. In the Puritan mind, it was a literal, tangible pact with malevolent forces, a written contract sealing an individual's damnation and empowering them to work evil. Mainstream historical fact is that the belief in a formal covenant or pact with the devil was central to the concept of witchcraft in early modern Europe and colonial America. It was believed that a witch would sign their name in a literal book belonging to the devil, thereby renouncing God and pledging allegiance to Satan in exchange for malefic power. This signature was seen as the ultimate act of apostasy and the source of all their supernatural abilities. You would hear accusers or confessors describe the devil appearing sometimes as a dark man, offering this book to be signed, a chilling narrative that painted a vivid picture of cosmic betrayal. Now, for a quirky tidbit, the accounts of the Devil's Book in confessions could sometimes include remarkably mundane details. Some confessors claimed the Devil's Book was made of red paper, others that it was cold to the touch, or that it contained only a few names. This mix of the supernatural and the prosaic adds a bizarre realism to the fabricated confessions. Imagine being told to describe the devil's actual pen or the texture of the page where you supposedly signed your soul away. It sounds less like a mystical ritual and more like a bureaucratic nightmare, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether the detailed descriptions of the Devil's Pact and book were primarily derived from European theological treatises on demonology, or if they were partly influenced by the structure of Puritan covenants and church membership agreements. Was it imported dogma or a local adaptation? Regardless, the concept of the Devil's Book was a powerful psychological tool in the trials. You would feel the immense pressure to confess to such an act, knowing that denying it meant denying the very framework of the accusations. The silence in the courtroom would be broken by the chilling recitation of a confession, each detail adding another layer of insidious proof, convincing a terrified populace that the devil was indeed among them, collecting signatures for his infernal ledger. From the terrifying concept of the Devil's Book, your thoughts might subtly shift to another underlying current, while not always explicitly stated: popish plots and witchcraft. The deep-seated anti-Catholic sentiment prevalent in Puritan New England, sometimes intertwined with anxieties about witchcraft, adding another layer of suspicion. A mainstream historical fact is that Puritan New England was fiercely Protestant, having broken away from the Church of England, which they still considered to popish or Catholic. They harbored a profound distrust of Catholicism, viewing it as idolatrous, superstitious, and inherently linked to the devil's work. This strong anti-Catholic bias often meant that anything perceived as superstitious or magical could be easily conflated with both witchcraft and Catholic practices, blurring the lines of accusation. You would hear sermons railing against the horror of Babylon, the Catholic Church, and the insidious nature of Satan, creating a mental landscape where anything not strictly Puritan could be seen as dangerous. Now for a quirky tidbit. While no direct evidence suggests Catholic priests were being accused of witchcraft in colonial New England, the broader fear of external, non-Puritan influences could inadvertently contribute to the atmosphere of paranoia. For instance, if an accused witch had ever expressed even a fleeting interest in charms or folk remedies that seemed vaguely similar to Catholic rituals, like using holy water, or specific prayers not from the King James Bible, it could be twisted as further evidence of their unholy leanings. Imagine a villager, perhaps having picked up a harmless folk cure from an English neighbor with Catholic leanings, suddenly finding themselves under suspicion because of it. It was guilt by association, wasn't it? Historians still argue whether the anti-Catholic sentiment played a significant direct role in specific witchcraft accusations, or if it merely contributed to a general atmosphere of intolerance and suspicion towards any perceived deviation from rigid Puritan orthodoxy. Was it a direct causal link or a contributing factor to widespread paranoia? Regardless, the underlying fear of popish plots certainly added another insidious layer to the already toxic environment of the witch trials. You would feel the cold judgment emanating from the stern Puritan faces, their conviction that the devil worked through many guises, including those that threatened their rigid religious purity. The whispers, already rife with accusations of witchcraft, sometimes carried the faint, chilling undertone of a perceived popish threat from the shadowy fears of popish plots. Your attention now turns to a glaring, almost criminal deficiency in the colonial justice system during the witch trials: the severe legal representation void. For those accused of witchcraft, the concept of a fair defense, as we understand it today, was virtually non-existent, leaving them utterly exposed to the whims of their accusers and judges. A mainstream historical fact is that in 17th century colonial New England, individuals accused of witchcraft and, indeed, many other crimes generally did not have the right to legal counsel in the way defendants do today. There were no professional defense lawyers appointed or even typically allowed to fully represent the accused. While defendants could speak for themselves, they were often uneducated, terrified, and overwhelmed by the legal procedures and the zealous questioning of the magistrates. You would stand in the courtroom watching an accused person, perhaps an illiterate farmer or a bewildered elderly woman, trying to articulate a defense against complex theological, and spectral accusations, completely alone against the formidable power of the court. Now, for a quirky tidbit. Even when a sympathetic individual might try to assist an accused person, their efforts were often limited to advising on procedure rather than actively cross-examining witnesses or challenging evidence. In some cases, attempting to defend an accused witch too vigorously could even lead to suspicion of witchcraft yourself, as if you were allied with the devil by trying to save his supposed agent. Imagine a courageous neighbor trying to speak up for an accused friend, only to be met with glares and murmurs of suspicion from the very people they were trying to help. It was a terrifying deterrent, wasn't it? Historians still argue whether the lack of formal legal representation was primarily a reflection of the undeveloped legal system of the time, or if it was a deliberate choice born from the belief that God Himself would reveal the truth, making human legal wrangling unnecessary in cases of such grave spiritual import. Was it legal primitivism or religious conviction? Regardless, the void in legal representation left the accused utterly vulnerable. You would feel the suffocating weight of injustice, knowing that the accused stood alone, stripped of any real means to defend their life and reputation. The courtroom was not a balanced arena of justice, but a one-sided interrogation driven by fear and belief, with little room for reason or due process. Their only advocate, if any, was their own trembling voice from the devastating void of legal representation. Your mind now turns to a powerful, almost invisible force that played a crucial role in escalating and sustaining the colonial witch trials. Community pressure's role. In these tightly knit Puritan villages, fear, conformity, and the desire to protect one's own reputation intensified the accusations, creating a chilling collective hysteria. A mainstream historical fact is that colonial New England communities were highly interdependent, with strong social bonds, but also immense pressure to conform to religious and societal norms. When accusations of witchcraft began, particularly in a small, isolated place like Salem Village, fear spread rapidly. Neighbors began to suspect neighbors, and the pressure to identify and condemn alleged witches became immense. Anyone who expressed doubt or defended an accused person too strongly risked becoming suspected themselves. You would feel the palpable tension in the air, the unspoken demand to conform, to believe the accusations, lest you be seen as complicit or, worse, a witch yourself. Now, for a quirky tidbit, the economic and social dynamics within these communities sometimes played a subtle, yet significant role. Accusations occasionally arose between families with long-standing grievances, or against individuals who were socially marginalized, economically vulnerable, or somehow different. While not the sole cause, pre-existing tensions could provide fertile ground for suspicion to take root and flourish under the guise of witch hunting. Imagine two families with a history of land disputes suddenly finding one of them accusing the other of witchcraft. It sounds like personal vendettas given a terrifying new outlet, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether the community pressure was primarily a psychological phenomenon, driven by genuine fear of the devil, or if it was also a reflection of existing social fractures and power dynamics within the villages. Was it mass hysteria or social opportunism? Regardless, the collective fear created a self-sustaining cycle of accusation and condemnation. You would sense the suffocating weight of conformity, the desperate need to align with the afflicted and the accusers to protect your own family and standing. The quiet whispers of doubt were quickly silenced by the roar of collective terror, making community pressure an invisible yet profoundly powerful legal loophole that condemned many innocent lives. From the crushing weight of community pressure, your mind now turns to a desperate, almost impossibly difficult path for the accused, the appeals process rare. In the high-stakes world of the colonial witch trials, challenging a conviction was a monumental undertaking, often fraught with additional peril, and rarely successful until much later. A mainstream historical fact is that while some form of appeal or petition for review might technically have existed in the colonial legal framework, it was exceedingly rare for a witchcraft conviction to be overturned during the height of the trials themselves. The deeply entrenched belief in witchcraft, coupled with the immense public pressure and the lack of proper legal representation, made challenging a verdict a perilous and often futile endeavor. You would imagine an accused person, or perhaps a brave family member, desperately drafting a petition, their hopes dim, knowing the immense power they were challenging. Now for a quirky tidbit, even when doubts about the validity of spectral evidence began to emerge, particularly among some of the more influential ministers and magistrates like Cotton Mather. Though he remained conflicted, it took immense courage for them to publicly challenge the proceedings. The initial resistance often came from within the religious establishment or from a few brave individuals, rather than from a formal legal appeals court as we understand it. Imagine a respected minister quietly beginning to question the evidence, knowing he might risk his own reputation or even safety by doing so. It was a slow, painful awakening, wasn't it? Historians still argue whether the eventual cessation of the Salem trials was primarily due to a growing legal skepticism about spectral evidence, a general exhaustion of the community, or the intervention of more rational voices from outside the immediate affected area? Was it a legal evolution, or simply a moral exhaustion? Regardless, the path to appeal was a brutal and almost non-existent one for the accused. You would feel the immense burden of trying to overturn a verdict based on invisible specters and coerced confessions, knowing that time was running out. The quiet whispers of reason, once drowned out by fear, slowly began to gain traction. But for many, it was far too late. The possibility of redress, you realize, was a rare and distant light in a very dark legal landscape. As our deep dive into the odd legal loopholes of Colonial American witch trials gently concludes, you're left with a profound sense of how fragile justice can be when overshadowed by fear and unyielding belief. It's striking to consider how these historical flaws still subtly resonate in the legacy of Loopholes, reminding us of the enduring importance of due process and critical thought. MAINSTREAM historical fact is that the eventual collapse of the Salem witch trials and the subsequent official apologies and reparations decades later led to significant reforms in American legal practices. The severe criticisms leveled against spectral evidence and coerced confessions helped solidify principles like the presumption of innocence, the right to confront accusers, and the need for tangible, verifiable evidence in court. Your modern legal system, with its emphasis on innocent until proven guilty and robust defense, is, in a very real way, a direct descendant of the painful lessons learned from those trials. Imagine the quiet, slow process of a community coming to terms with its past mistakes, painstakingly rebuilding a justice system from the ground up. Now, for a quirky tidbit, even today, in various legal systems, debates sometimes arise about the admissibility of certain types of subjective evidence, such as psychological profiling or highly circumstantial testimony. While thankfully not involving specters, these discussions echo the historical challenge of discerning truth when evidence is nebulous. The Salem trials serve as a stark, albeit extreme, cautionary tale about the dang